I was 71 years old when I realized that silence can become a habit, not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind. My name is Walter. I had lived alone for nearly 12 years by then, not because I wanted to, because life slowly rearranged itself and I didn't stop it. My wife, Margaret, passed away after a long illness, not suddenly, gradually. The kind of goodbye that stretches over years until you forget what normal sounded like. After the funeral, people checked in. Friends, neighbors, distant relatives. They brought casseroles and sympathy. Then, one by one, they returned to their lives. I stayed behind. At first, I told myself I enjoyed the quiet. No schedules, no noise, no explanations. But quiet, when it lasts too long, begins to echo. My days followed a careful routine. Morning coffee at the same kitchen table, a walk around the block at the same hour, dinner eaten in front of the television, volume turned low. I spoke to no one most days. Weeks passed like that, then months. The strange thing about loneliness is that it doesn't announce itself. It blends in. I became efficient at being alone. Neighbors waved, I nodded. Conversation stayed polite and short. "How are you holding up?" they asked. "Doing fine," I replied. That sentence became automatic. I didn't even check if it was true. One afternoon, while waiting at a small bus stop downtown, something unexpected happened. A man sat down next to me. He was younger, maybe in his late 60s. He looked tired. Not physically, internally. Neither of us spoke at first. The bus was late. Minutes passed. Then he sighed and said, "Funny how quiet it gets after retirement." I looked at him, really looked, and instead of nodding and letting the moment pass, I answered. "It does," I said. "Quieter than anyone warns you about." He smiled, not politely, relieved. That conversation lasted 10 minutes. Nothing profound. We talked about the weather, about aching knees, about how days blend together. Then the bus arrived. He stood up, hesitated, and said, "I'm Frank." "Walter," I replied. That was it. We went our separate ways, but something stayed with me. That night, the house felt different, not fuller, awake. I realized how long it had been since I had spoken without performing strength, since I had answered honestly without worrying about making someone uncomfortable. The next week, I found myself returning to that same bus stop, not because I needed the bus, because I needed possibility. Frank wasn't there. I waited anyway. The following day, he showed up. He smiled when he saw me. We sat together again, and again. Over time, those conversations grew longer, deeper. Frank had lost his wife, too. Different story, same aftermath. We didn't try to fix each other. We just listened. One morning, Frank said something that unsettled me. He said, "I think we get used to disappearing. No one pushes back." That sentence stayed with me all day, because it was true. I had been shrinking quietly, assuming that was the natural order of things. That night, standing in my kitchen, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What if this isn't the end phase of life? What if it's just the quietest beginning? I didn't know the answer, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to find out. The change didn't happen all at once. It arrived in small interruptions. Frank and I began meeting regularly at the bus stop, even on days when neither of us had anywhere to go. Eventually, we started walking instead, around the park, past the library, sometimes nowhere in particular. We didn't label it friendship. We just showed up. One morning, Frank suggested coffee, not a cafe, a diner, the kind with chipped mugs and laminated menus. We sat across from each other, hands wrapped around warm cups, watching people come and go. You ever notice, Frank said, how everyone's rushing but no one looks like they know where they're going? I smiled. I used to be one of them, I said. So did I. There was comfort in that admission, not nostalgia, recognition. As weeks passed, our conversations changed. We talked less about the past and more about what filled our days now, or didn't. Frank admitted he often went entire days without speaking out loud. I told him I sometimes turned on the television just to hear another voice. Neither of us laughed because we both understood. One afternoon, Frank asked a question that caught me off guard. What do you miss doing? Not who, what? I thought about it longer than I expected. I used to write, I said finally. Nothing important, just letters, stories, thoughts. What happened? Life, I replied. He nodded. That answer needed no explanation. The next week, Frank brought a small notebook and slid it across the table. Start again, he said. I didn't open it right away. That night, I placed the notebook on my kitchen counter and stared at it. The house was quiet, but this time the quiet felt different, inviting. I wrote one sentence, then another. Nothing polished, nothing brave, just honest. Days later, I noticed something subtle. I was standing straighter, not physically, internally. I started choosing different routes on my walks, sitting on different benches, saying hello to people I had nodded at for years. Some ignored me, some didn't. The ones who didn't surprised me. One morning, a woman from the neighborhood stopped me. "You seem lighter lately," she said. I thanked her. I didn't explain. I wasn't lighter. I was more present. Frank and I began volunteering once a week at the local food pantry, not out of obligation, out of structure. It gave our days shape. It gave conversations context. One afternoon, as we were stacking boxes, Frank paused. "You know," he said, "I used to think this part of life was about letting go." I waited. "Now I think it's about choosing again," he finished. That idea followed me home. Choosing again. At 71. I thought about how many decisions I had stopped making simply because no one asked me to. No one asked if I wanted to matter. They assumed I didn't. That assumption had become convenient, comfortable, but comfort, I was learning, can be another form of disappearance. That evening, I opened the notebook again. I wrote about Margaret, not her illness, her laugh, the way she used to tap her fingers when thinking. I cried, not from sadness, from relief. I hadn't avoided her memory, I had avoided my own voice. And now it was coming back, quietly, but clearly. The fear didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in quietly, disguised as practicality. One evening, Frank didn't show up. No message, no explanation. I waited at the usual bench longer than I should have, watching the light fade through the trees. My first thought wasn't concern, it was retreat. Well, I told myself, this is how it goes. People come, people leave. I went home and made dinner for one. The television stayed off. That night, the silence felt familiar again. Too familiar. The next morning, I nearly skipped our walk. Old habits are persuasive. They tell you that disappointment is safer than hope. But something in me resisted. I went anyway. Frank was there, sitting slowly, his shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," he said before I could speak. "Bad night. Doctor appointment." I nodded, relieved, then ashamed of how quickly I had assumed the worst. We walked in silence for a while. Then Frank stopped. "I get scared sometimes," he said, "that if I let myself care too much, it'll all disappear again." I looked at him. "That's exactly why I stopped talking for years," I replied. We stood there, Two men well past the age of reinvention, admitting fear without trying to fix it. That was new. A week later, Frank suggested something that made my chest tighten. "There's a community reading event next month," he said. "You should read something." I laughed. He didn't. "I'm serious," he said. "You write. I've seen it." "No," I replied too quickly. "That's not for people like me." People like me, retired, invisible, out of practice. Frank didn't argue. He just nodded. "Think about it," he said. I tried not to, but the idea followed me home. I imagined standing in front of strangers, my voice shaking. I imagined silence, judgment. Then I imagined not going. That image felt heavier. For days I avoided the notebook. Then one afternoon I opened it and reread what I had written. It wasn't impressive, but it was honest. That mattered. I remembered something Margaret used to say. If it scares you a little, it probably still matters. The night before the event, I barely slept. I told myself I didn't have to go. No one would notice. But that was the problem. The next evening, I stood in the back of a small room filled with folding chairs. Frank waved me over. "You don't have to read," he whispered. "Just sit." But when my name was called, I stood up. My hands shook. My voice wavered. Then I read. I read about quiet kitchens, about losing routine before losing people, about how loneliness doesn't scream, it whispers. When I finished, no one clapped immediately. For a moment, I thought I had failed. Then someone said, "Thank you." Another nodded. A woman wiped her eyes. That was enough. Afterward, Frank smiled like I had just done something enormous. I didn't feel brave. I felt present. On the walk home, something settled inside me. I hadn't stepped back into the world loudly. I had stepped into it honestly. And honesty, I realized, doesn't fade with age. It deepens. The days after the reading felt different. Not exciting, aligned. People at the park nodded differently now. Not because they recognized me from the event, because I was standing differently. Frank and I kept our routines. Walks, coffee, volunteering, but there was a new layer. We talked about what we might still do. Not someday, soon. I continued writing. Not every day, but honestly, sometimes just a paragraph, sometimes a page. I wasn't trying to publish anything. I was trying to stay visible to myself. One afternoon, a woman from the reading event stopped me on the street. "I didn't know how to explain my loneliness until I heard you," she said. I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. I didn't know how to explain mine either. That exchange stayed with me, not as pride, as connection. Months passed. Life didn't transform into something unrecognizable. It simply opened. I started attending community events without forcing myself to speak. Sometimes I just listened. That was enough. Frank's health slowed him down a bit. We adjusted. Sat more, walked less. Presence mattered more than pace. One evening, sitting on a bench as the sun lowered, Frank said something quietly. "I used to think getting older meant shrinking." I waited. "Now I think it means choosing what not to shrink from." I nodded. That felt right. At home, I placed the notebook on a shelf instead of hiding it in a drawer, not as an achievement, as a reminder. I wasn't finished. None of us are. If you are listening to this and wondering what remains for you, please hear this. Life doesn't close doors because of age. We stop knocking. Your voice doesn't disappear. It waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for one honest moment. At 71, I didn't reinvent myself. I returned, and that return made everything else possible, quietly, gently, fully.